people may make their peace with conditions of unfreedom. Okay, so we humans are survivors. We will survive in a concentration camp. But when that individual agency is taken away, then the dynamism is lost. People stop thinking, people stop creating. The culture, the arts, the science, the business, all these things go into a dull despondence. And what you need for a poor country like India is the opposite of that. What we need is an effervescence of optimism, of creativity, of invention, of people starting a business, of people coming up with a new business model. And freedom lies at the heart of all these things.
Welcome to Everything is Everything. I'm sitting here with my good friend Ajay Shah. I'm Amit, as you know, and in the background there is a young cat which is mewing, and I needed to clarify that because it sounds like the wailing of all the dispossessed and the hungry and the starving through these many, many years of India's tormented journey. But that journey is fine now, right? We gained political independence in 47. We had the reforms in 91. Ajay, is everything well with the world now?
There was a freedom movement that got us to the ejection of colonial rule in 47. But it's striking that actually, in many ways, freedom did not come to the people in the period after 1947. So there is something very disappointing that we were supposed to have played a freedom movement. And actually, we ended up with less freedom in many respects.
I couldn't agree more. And there's a book here, right here, Freedom at Midnight by Lapierre and Collins. And circa 2008, I went to the New India Foundation with a proposal for a book I wanted to write called Freedom After Midnight, where the point that I was going to make through the book is that all we got in 47 was political freedom. We didn't get personal freedom, social freedoms, economic freedoms. And I never ended up writing that book because I'm a lazy bum, but and they rejected my proposal, but I should have written it anyway, but I didn't. But the point there is that I've used that phrase, India's second freedom struggle, again and again, and I couldn't agree more with you. And I know we are both agreed on, the fundamental quality of the word freedom itself.
So, Amit, tell us, what are your big ideas on understanding India's journey? What has happened to us? And I always think of the interrelated pieces of freedom, the state capability, the capability of the private sector, and then the outcome, that is prosperity. How do these pieces work?
So I want to get into the weeds with you later, and I'm looking to get a lot of illumination from you on this. So much of this episode is going to be about India's journey towards freedom, where we've taken a few baby steps forwards, we've taken a few baby steps backwards, and we'll talk about that journey. But before that, as a whole, I want to talk about the importance of freedom to me and the way I like to reframe it, because freedom is such a misused word and there are so many ways in which it can be interpreted and used. I like to think in terms of consent, but in many ways you can, you can use it interchangeably with freedom. And this is a book I am planning to write seriously at some point, where I'm asking myself sort of two questions, right? And one question is, how should I live in this world? And the other question is, how should the state relate to society? How should we all relate to each other? And most people would think these questions are in different domains. One is a question of personal ethics and the other is a question of political philosophy. But to me, the answer is the same. The answer is consent. That consent is everything and coercion is the ultimate evil. And you can use freedom interchangeably as a word for this. And at one level, you can get at it deontologically, as the philosophers would say, but I don't want to use jargon, but you can come at it as a first principle and say consent is good for its own sake. If individual autonomy is to matter, if our lives are to have meaning, then consent matters. And therefore, you can go all the way back to John Locke and his right to self-ownership and how we arrive at all our rights through that. But I find that that is one way to make the point about why freedom is important, but I think you can arrive at it from another direction, where you can talk about how freedom is always consequentially good, where you can you can go to consequentialism and say that freedom has the best outcome for society, freedom has the best outcome for individuals. And obviously within all of this there is what I call the grand liberal paradox, that to enjoy our rights we need a state to take care of those rights, and the existence of the state means we are giving away some of those rights. The state has a monopoly on violence, it takes taxes and blah blah blah. So leave that aside for the moment. But the value of freedom in our lives, I think, is often understated because of the fundamental reason that we think of the world as a fixed pie. And we intuitively, perhaps because our brains evolved in times where we lived in small tribes, in times of scarcity, but intuitively we think of the world in a zero sum way. If I am to get richer, you must get poorer. If I am to get something, I must take it from you. But the world is not like that. And there is a brilliant chart and a series of charts that illustrates this, which you'll see on the screen now. This is by Angus Madison, and it is a chart of world GDP growth through history. And suddenly, around the time 1800, you see global GDP growth just absolutely shoot up. Right? And why is that happening? That's happening because of the industrial revolution, which is, and the globalization that ensures, which is enabling voluntary transactions. And I've spoken in an earlier episode where we spoke about Bastiat and Hayek and had so much fun. I've spoken about the double thank you moment. This is John Stossel's formulation. The double thank you moment is, if you are, say, selling coffee at a coffee shop and I'm a customer, when I hand you the money, I say thank you. When you hand me the coffee, you say thank you. Both of us benefited from the transaction.
There is a science and engineering view that the Industrial Revolution came to the UK because they got to Newton, who was born in 1642, and the steam engine, which was 1776, and the motive force is attributed to science and engineering. How would you respond to that? Because there are parts of the world, in China and other countries, where there are people who are willing to make the bargain that we should take the package of modern science and technology, but apart from that, we can just be as thuggish as we like.
I think science and technology enabled all of this. It enabled globalization. It enabled us to trade. For example, through science and technology, you got the railways. But through railways, you had the tremendous trade. But the point I was getting at is that every voluntary transaction leaves both people better off. And therefore, the more voluntary transactions there are, the more the wealth of the world goes up. And look at the chart again, Angus Madison's chart. That's exactly what you see happening. This is the overall wealth of the world going up, which tells you it's not a zero-sum world. It's almost as if by magic that the wealth of the world is a particular way. You and I exchange things and suddenly we are both better off. To me, that's magical, and that's a magic of trade. That's a magic of voluntary action. Now look at these other charts right here, which shows that happening to, in a country-wise kind of breakup. In fact, if you look at the third chart right here, what you'll see here is, you see China, Deng takes over. Sure, no freedom, all of that. We've argued about it in a previous episode, but market-friendly, allowing voluntary transactions among the people without granting political freedom and all of that. But still, look at the chart. Look at India's growth since 92, and as you'll elaborate later, since 1977 in a certain way. It's a very complicated story. We'll get into the weeds later. But my broader point is that if you look at these charts again, what you'll see is that economic freedom correlates to prosperity, and that is a big freaking deal. Like, just to take an example, our mutual friend Nitin Pai likes to give a stat that he likes to give, that is, after we liberalized in 91, every 1% growth in GDP meant that 3 million people came out of poverty. He earlier used to say 2 million, now he's revised his assumptions to 3 million. That's a staggering humanitarian good. And obviously, there are many things flawed with GDP, there are many nuances there, but broadly, that's a staggering humanitarian good that we brought 300-400 million people out of poverty after the 91 reforms. And again, there are nuances. One could argue that the course for that was laid earlier, and we can talk about that. But throughout the world, this has been the case. So much so that one can almost understand Francis Fukuyama asking the question when the Soviet Union collapsed, is this the end of history? And there was a question mark to that. And by end of history, he didn't mean end as in it is over, but end as in the end and means kind of end. That is this the aim of history, that we live in liberal democracies and we are all prosperous and successful? And obviously, the world is complicated, and history continued down its merry way. But underscoring the value of freedom is really important, because I find that so many, like 70% of India has been born after the Berlin Wall collapsed, right? We have forgotten those lessons. So many young people in the world today were born after that time. They have forgotten the horrors of socialism and communism, and they underestimate the power of freedom and the lessons we should have learned. And some will, of course, point to the welfare economies of this Scandinavia and say, look, wahan pe kitna freedom hai. But A, you still have a great deal of freedom there when it comes to starting a business, ease of doing business, the way people live their lives, personal and social freedoms are great. And B, all of them became rich when they were basically free markets. And once they had brought their standard of living to a certain level, then they could do their welfare statism and it didn't really matter so much. And that's a point that unfortunately we need to keep underscoring, because again, to repeat, it is not intuitive. There are two counter-intuitive elements here. One is that the world is a positive sum game. It is not a fixed pie. It is not zero sum. And we somehow think of the world, we are wired to think of the world in zero sum ways. And the other point is that we are also wired to think in this kind of top down mindset, that everything beautiful that exists must be planned and made by someone. You could say religion itself is an example of this delusion, but actually that's not the case. Economists have this beautiful term, spontaneous order. Languages, economies, societies, natural selection itself does not need a central planner or a designer, and many of them are the products of human action and not human design, as Adam Ferguson would say. So I just wanted to lay out this broad picture, which I know you'll agree with, about the importance of freedom in every domain and how much it means. And of course, even beyond all of this, it means a lot to me at a basic moral level. But even if you are to argue in terms of consequences, and we need to see how we can get the greatest good for all, even there I would argue that it's freedom which gives you that, and no matter what else you value, freedom is the root.
Another way we see this is that people may make their peace with conditions of unfreedom. Okay, so we humans are survivors. We will survive in a concentration camp. But when that individual agency is taken away, then the dynamism is lost. People stop thinking, people stop creating. The culture, the arts, the science, the business, all these things go into a dull despondence. And what you need for a poor country like India is the opposite of that. What we need is an effervescence of optimism, of creativity, of invention, of people starting a business, of people coming up with a new business model. And freedom lies at the heart of all these things.
So, Ajay, I'm going to ask you to, begin our grand narrative of the day of India. Sort of take me through your sense of India through the centuries, as it were, and, bring me to independent India, and then we can start talking about that.
Okay. Here is a quick summary of many, many books. Okay. So let's start at really old days. There is a lot of excitement when Angus Madison and others have described India as the largest GDP in some ways at some points in time. But it's important to remember that those were pre-industrial times. So output was agricultural, and India is blessed with good weather, large number of people. And so it looks like the GDP in India was pretty high. It must be clarified that that GDP was at abysmal levels. So it was not a great world for anybody anywhere in the world. But in terms of aggregate GDP, India looks good. Okay, it was not a golden age. There were levels of poverty and deprivation and cruelty that were in India that were out of the world. There was very little political development. There was no rule of law. Okay, so that is the old India. Then under colonial rule, I am transfixed at the explosions that took place in the 1860s and 1870s. Okay, in a very real sense, that is the beginning of modernity in India. And there is a whole bunch of events that came together. The most important was 1869, when the Suez Canal started working and the physical distance between London and Bombay came down dramatically. Earlier, a ship from London would go around the Cape of Good Hope, and once you're going that far, you could even go all the way to Calcutta. After the Suez Canal, it became dramatically shorter. You came out of London, went through the Straits of Gibraltar, went through the Mediterranean, came into the Red Sea, and boom, you are at Bombay. So it was a revolution in India's connectivity into global trade. Also, around that time, there were many, many important technological innovations that came into India for the first time, most notably the telegraph and the railroad. When in the 1860s, the first telegraph connections came to Bombay, and there was a 4 hour delay to get a message from London to Bombay and vice versa, which you will agree is pretty miraculous in that age. So, cotton speculators would be able to talk to each other, and these markets started getting globally integrated. It seems amazing. Then we should look at the institutional infrastructure that makes the modern market economy possible. There was a revolutionary set of developments which took place in the UK. The Companies Act, Contract Act, the Evidence Act, all these pieces came to India. Within just a couple of years after the Companies Act happening in London, it came to Bombay. In 1874, we got the Bombay Stock Exchange. And this entire ferment in Bombay got an explosive moment in the form of the Civil War in the United States, where supplies of cotton from America to the UK were interrupted. And an entire cotton trade was invented in India, where cotton was grown in Gujarat and Maharashtra, and it was shipped through Bombay to London. So this was an explosive moment for the Indian economy. It's hard to emphasize what a break this was as compared with everything that came before. It's like the entire institutional package and the technological capability of the Industrial Revolution was seeded into India all at once. Okay? And in many ways, this journey progressed relatively well till 1913.
So, a couple of things here. One is that much as the Indian cotton industry did well because of the American Civil War, in America, there was an explosion in the Midwest when a bunch of factories were set up for making ice. Do you know why?
No?
Okay, the reason for that is that in India there was a huge problem of malaria. And the way to deal with malaria was a substance called quinine. And quinine was given as a precautionary thing. However, quinine could not be had on its own. It was bitter and ugly. So it was put into tonic water, and gin and tonic became a popular cocktail in India. And if you had to have gin and tonic, you needed ice with it. Now, this is the 19th century. No fridges. Where will the ice come from? America will make the ice. So the wonders of global capitalism. And on what you were saying, I also want to quote your friend Tirthankar Roy, the great Indian historian. And Vinay Sitapati sent me this essay, and so credit to him for that. But Tirthankar writes at the end of this fabulous essay, which I'll link from the show notes, he writes, "The empire created an open economy, open to trade, capital flows and settlement. For the imperialists, keeping India open to trade, investment and migration served British economic interest. But that does not amount to saying that openness was damaging to Indian economic interests. The two interests were broadly compatible until the 1920s and diverged around the time of the Great Depression. But when world trade again recovered from World War II, India had left the stage. In the colonial era, openness contributed to the emergence of a robust industrial capitalism centered in the port cities. It helped the growth of a sophisticated education system. The cosmopolitanism was sustained by the free movement of people, skills, and knowledge. It is certainly possible to criticize individual factors, individual items of factor payment, but economic nationalists fundamentally misread these flows by calling these drain. They were the price India paid to tap into a mobile market for skills and capital." Exactly what you were saying.
Yeah. So I feel that the breathtaking developments which took place in the 1860s and 1870s have not been adequately recognized in India, not least because I feel the nationalists have oversold their case. Okay, so I mean, I do not pine for colonial rule, but we should be cold and clear in understanding history and understanding the events that took place. So this period ran till 1913. So this first modernization of India, which coincides with what internationally is called the first globalization, was roughly 1869 to 1913. Then came a long dark period because of the First World War and the Great Depression and the Second World War, and within India, the unrest of the freedom movement and the horrors of partition. So from 1913 to 1947, many things went very badly for India. And it was also a period where the British took many policy decisions that were inimical to the interests of the Indian economy. For example, the restrictions on trade and capital flows came as a wartime measure in 1939. Okay, so the loss of freedom began as wartime measures in British rule and what has been normalized today. By the way, while I'm on this subject, I just want to take the audiences back to a breathtaking fact. Did you know that before 1914, there were no passports anywhere in the world, meaning there were no passport requirements? The royalty would write passports to each other asking for preferential treatment for their friends. But for the people, the freedom to travel, the freedom to migrate was just there. It was an inalienable human right. Similarly, there were no capital controls until Adolf Hitler first introduced capital controls in Germany. So the freedoms of that period are breathtaking when compared to the unfreedom that we have all normalized today.
And yeah, exactly. That's what I was about to say. That we normalize these lack of unfreedoms, and now we imagine, our passports are a natural state of the world. Obviously, capital controls will be there, but
Oh, and then let me make this even more spicy. One of the clauses of the Treaty of Versailles was the restoration of passport free travel. Okay, and international conferences were convened all the way into the 60s on how to get back to passport free travel. And the spoiler of that was Soviet Russia, which wanted to imprison its own citizens, which never wanted Russian people to leave because, they would never come back. So Soviet Russia blocked every movement on trying to restore passport free travel, and only now we have the beginning of the restoration of that old freedom in limited ways in the form of the European Union. The European Union is that great development of globalization where the people move freely between France, Germany, and Belgium and UK. Oh, scratch that, not UK. Without passports. That's the restoration of the customary freedoms that we had 100 years ago. Okay, so then we got to that terrible period in India's history where many things went wrong. Okay, and then came freedom in 1947. In terms of the outcomes, per capita GDP growth did pretty well from 1947 to 1962. In my opinion, this has a lot to do with just the reduction of social tension and conflict. We'd just been through the strife of the freedom movement. Remember a Second World War lapping at the eastern edges of India. One minor character, Subhash Chandra Bose, threatening armed conflict in India. And of course, the horrors of partition. So that was not an environment in which people felt safe about their
দেখুন দাদা,
future.
বাঙালির ব্যাপারে কিছু বলবে না।
Okay,
সুভাষচন্দ্র বোস আমাদের
Okay, fine. So scratch the Subhash Chandra Bose.
Yeah.
Huh. And that is an environment where private sector confidence was likely to be weak. And so there was a reduction in the growth momentum of that period. And in 1947, when there was that political certainty that there is a Republic of India and the prestige of the Indian constitution of Nehru and Patel and others, it was a glorious generation, and that created confidence, and many people got back to action, and there was decent GDP growth in the period from 47 to 62. It was also a period in which things went very badly in terms of the fundamental strategy of growth. Back to you.
Back to me. So, before I sort of continue the narrative, I also want to point out that I've been chatting with Vinay Sitapati, who wrote a great book on Narasimha Rao and the BJP before Modi. And a point he made where that impressed me a lot is that we should think of the liberalization of 91 as a re-liberalization of 91. His point is that it was Nehru's Fabian socialism and central planning that was a break from the past. You've already pointed out one piece of the puzzle, which is, how Bombay, Calcutta, the port cities were booming under the British as they wired into global trade. The other piece of the puzzle that Vinay cites is from this magnificent book that, many of the Mughal historians I've spoken to on this show adore, which is In the Persianate Age by Richard Richard Eaton.
Yes.
And in that, Eaton talks about how like one India share of the world GDP, as you pointed out, purely by dint of population was really high at one point in time under them. But at the same time, the decline possibly started because of global trade, because there was so much global trade coming in at the ports, and the power went to the edges where the ports were, and that centralized power kind of began to decline. That's a fascinating narrative. I don't want to talk too much about that yet because I need to, study that a bit more. But let's come back to 47, and when we talk about what went wrong, I want to shift back to a frame that I learnt about from a writer both of us admire, William Easterly wrote this paper in circa 2006 or 2008 for ADB, and I'll quote from that. So in this paper, Easterly says, quote, historically poverty has never been ended by central planners. It is only ended by searchers, both economic and political, who explore solutions by trial and error, have a way to get feedback on the ones that work, and then expand the ones that work, all of this in an unplanned, spontaneous way. Examples of searchers are firms in private markets and democratically accountable politicians. Stop quote. So basically markets and this feedback mechanism and all that.
The beautiful phrase which we always talk about, discovery, not design.
Discovery, not design. More from Easterly. A planner thinks he already knows the answers. He thinks of poverty as a technical engineering problem that his answers will solve. A searcher admits he doesn't know the answers in advance. He believes that poverty is a complicated tangle of political, social, historical, institutional, and technological factors. A searcher only hopes to find answers to individual problems by trial and error in experimentation. A planner believes outsiders know enough to impose solutions. A searcher believes only insiders have enough knowledge to find solutions, and that most solutions must be homogeneous, and so on and so forth. Easterly's written great books. We'll link all of them from the show notes. But I also want to now, for a moment, shift to what was Nehru's mindset, right? Nehru famously at one point said to J.R.D. Tata, "Do not speak to me of profit. It is a dirty word." He had a distrust of profit. He had a distrust of capitalism, and part of it was understandable. Part of it was that, look, who colonized India? The East India Company, right? It was a
And also, I described a period from 1913 onwards, which were the most important years. If you stood in 1947 and look back, the predominant picture of the advanced Western economies was pretty grim. They had fought 2 wars, they had had a Great Depression, things hadn't worked so well, and also there was a lot of Soviet propaganda about how the crude mobilization of resources by central planners, okay, things like putting together an Air India, putting together a UPI, these were the kinds of projects which had been done in the Soviet Union, and in the short term they look good because you avoid the messy searching process. Suddenly you mobilize the entire country around a new format of how to use capital and labor.
And you also have to see who his influences are. In our episode on Newton and Gandhi, when we spoke about Gandhi, we looked at his intellectual influences. Who were Nehru's intellectual influences? Now, there's a Time magazine piece of 1951 which says brilliantly, Beatrice and Sidney Webb, the godparents of Fabian socialism, are in a truer sense his creators than Vishnu and Shiva. And the same magazine piece goes on to describe Nehru thus: he shares all the socialist emotional tenets about the capitalist order. In consequence, he has a socialist undisguised contempt for capitalism, reinforced by the aristocratic Brahmins' contempt for the Baniya caste. He speaks of the, Nehru's words, Baniya civilization of the capital West, of the West's cutthroat civilization, again Nehru's words. Utterly unlike Gandhi, he admires modern production methods and wants to bring them to India. He has announced that India will in time develop her own atomic energy program, but as a socialist, he believes that capitalism, after its prodigies of production, is bound to make a bloody and cruel mess of distribution. This view is based on the standard British socialist reading of 19th century economic history. His understanding of 20th century American capitalism is negligible. Stop quote. And another of his great influences was Harold Lasky. John Kenneth Galbraith once said the center of Nehru's thinking was Lasky. And Ram Guha once quoted an unnamed wit as saying that at every cabinet meeting there was an empty seat and Harold Lasky sat on it, right? Which is, and one can't really blame him. At one level, he was a creature of the times, but at the same time, all the material really existed had he been open to it. He ignored C. Rajgopalachari, Rajaji, a great man who, understood the power of freedom that we spoke about, who looked not to Russia but to the success of America. And today we know the successes of Russia
So can
were
I come
illusory.
back at that period in a somewhat different way? I am puzzled about the following propositions. In 1947, while everything you describe about the ideology was there, the scale of intervention into the economy was relatively modest. Okay, so the civil service quality was extremely high. We've never had a better civil service in India than was present in 1947. And the scale of intervention into the society was relatively mild. The level of freedom was relatively high. And we were off to the races with a reasonably decentralized economy where people were calling the shots and the people were deciding many things. Gradually, the loss of freedom began. Okay, day after day, the restrictions started coming in. State agencies started flexing their muscles and controlling the lives of the people more and more. What I find puzzling and disappointing is how long this took before any self correction came about. It is okay to be wrong, it is not okay to be impervious to the evidence. It is tragic and disappointing for that intellectual community, who I continue to respect in many ways. These were some of the smartest people you could have got. But they responded to failure by intensification. There was a commitment to ideology which is disappointing. And it seems that every time there was a failure, there would be these debates around a Hindu rate of growth. And the answer was to remain locked in that ideology and to insist that the floggings will continue until the morale improves. And to me, that is just tragic and a failure. That it's okay to make mistakes. It's not okay to refuse to change course. That pragmatism was lost in the commitment to an ideology.
I want to make 2 points, and one is a really broader point, and it's about a debate which is, I think, at the heart of India today and what we need to think about, and that is a constant tussle between state and society. It's something I've discussed in many of my episodes of The Seen and the Unseen. Last night I was chatting with Vinay Sitapati on the phone, and he also brought it up, and I agree with him that this is at the core of the break of 1947, that couple of things happened. One is, you think of our early leaders, those who framed our constitution, and others, sitting in Delhi where the country seems to be falling apart, right? All around them. So obviously there is an urge to centralize. There is an urge to make sure that the center does indeed hold, right? And indeed, I sometimes think of the next few months that follow what Sardar Patel and VP Menon did as a kind of a fast track colonization of India. What the British took 200-300 years to do, we did in a matter of a couple of years. And I have a great episode on VP Menon on that, which I'll link from the show notes as well. And so there was that centralizing impulse for a political reason, number one. Number two, there was a centralizing impulse for a social reason, where someone like Ambedkar, one of our great thinkers, the giant of the 20th century, looks around him and says that, listen, we can't be too decentralized because villages are dens of localism, ignorance, etc., etc. Essentially, they're riddled with caste, which is, one of our original sins. And therefore, if you just say decentralize and all of that, it's not going to happen. We'll all slowly go to hell. So you need a transformative constitution, as it were, which is a phrase I kind of despise because it carries with it, connotations of so much state coercion and so much social engineering, which can never work and which hasn't worked, and we know it cannot. But that is, you understand that impulse, that you simply cannot leave it to our basest instincts as reflected in village life, what Ambedkar had seen and experienced himself. So you understand his sense that, okay, to build a great society, we must centralize, we must direct it from the top down, we must teach them how to think. I say teach them how to think because our friend Madhav Khosla talks about how the constitution was a pedagogic exercise as much as an, exercise for setting rules, right? So these are two: political, social, and then there was economic, where again Nehru is coming from a point of saying that, hey, the East India Company failed us, profit is a dirty word, capitalism is bad, I hate these bania capitalists, blah, blah, blah. And therefore and there is in all of these people, and they're all elites in a sense, right? And there is in all of these people this sense that we are above the people and we will forge a better world. They know not what they are doing. And I think that there was a certain folly here. I think in a sense today's, that arrogance has been consequential, that society has caught up with politics today. And again, let's not get into current day politics. But I think there was a mistake there by those who wanted liberal values and a free society to say that that can only be imposed from the top down. Whereas I continue to believe, though it would have been difficult to see then or argue then, that it can only happen from the bottom up. So that is one, the social level. And two, at the economic level, what it did, Nehru's move towards central planning and some of the policies that I'll ask you to expand on, is that it created this environment where dissenters were completely shut out, the profit motive was shut out. Like P. Chidambaram, someone you know well, you worked with him, once said, quote, India suspected capitalists, it suspected the profit motive, and it tried to nail it down, block it, and thought that all growth would come from government planning. By the late 1980s, Korea was a miracle economy and India was a stagnant, slow trot kind of economy. The whole idea that there was a big market out there did not strike Indian planners, stop quote. And this is what strikes me, that when you say that, okay, we reached 5% growth rate from 47 to 62, approximately 5% or whatever, the thing is, it's great in comparison to the years immediately before, because you had the Second World War, you had so much social drive. It is terrible when you consider the counterfactuals of what happened in Southeast Asia, where Korea
Agreed.
went, and all because of freedom, because they understood the power of
Agreed
concept.
completely. So I just want to say, when you look at the Indian historical experience, the outcomes look decent. When you look under the hood, the inputs are actually pretty bad. So what is the conduct of policy is poor, and the news tightens as the years go by. So, as I said, right in 1947, there were decent levels of freedom. Exchange convertibility was there. You had full convertibility of the current account and the capital account for some time. Things like that. But then, bit by bit, it started getting worse, and a vast repressive machinery started getting established. And the decisive moment is, of course, Nehru's death in 64, which was preceded by the China War in 62.
So Ajay, let's talk about that period of 62 to 77. In fact, in the notes that I have in front of me, you've described that period as terrifying.
Yeah.
Take me through it. Give me the broad strokes. Also, give me, some specifics so I can get a feel of what was going wrong there.
India was a precocious political project in a country in 1947 where women's literacy was 6%. There was the audacity of thinking that we'll have universal suffrage. And there were many skeptics, as there should be. It is odd and weird that in such an unprepared country, we are trying to do a complex constitution building project, a republic, as it were, trying to come about in a place where really.
And with all credit to our founders, if I may interrupt, they got this one thing really right. We've been kind of criticizing, Nehru and the other makers of the Constitution and all of that, but they did so much right in building those institutions and keeping us free and secular. It's a big deal.
Yeah. The optimism around that political project was severely challenged by the 1962 to 1977 project, and many people thought that this is going to turn into yet another disgusting third world authoritarian country, or worse, that this country will collapse into civil war. So let's walk just a quick sketch of the events. 1962 was the China War. 1964, Nehru died. In 65, there was a war with Pakistan. There were 2 consecutive droughts. There was famine in the country. India was begging for food aid from the United States, the PL 480. Then came the 71 war. While the 71 war was a nationalist wet dream, it was also an enormous economic burden for a poor country. It was expensive to do these things. In 1969, Indira Gandhi nationalized the banks, and there was a whole wave of economic repression, like the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, the FERA of 1973. Okay, and all of which led to an economic collapse in the early 70s. It is striking to see how quickly the euphoria of the Bangladesh war and Indira Gandhi's mind-blowing Lok Sabha victory turned into an abysmal economic collapse, double-digit inflation, the JP agitation, and then we got to the emergency. So this is the terrifying period, that the economic growth was in bad shape. The conduct of the state turned from bad to horrendous. and there was a collapse of freedom. There was the decline into the emergency. And the critics of the Indian project could wag their fingers and say, "We told you so." That this is a dumb idea, that a free India, which will try to become a republic and have a one man, one vote, will just not work. And it is the fate of poor countries to turn into disgusting authoritarian countries. Populists will always win. Remember, the first Prime Minister of India who is classified by political scientists as a populist was Indira Gandhi. And this was the period where really our optimism in the entire Indian dream was shaken. And there were many serious people who thought that this is not going to work. We're just going to become another disgusting authoritarian third world country with no redeeming features.
So I just want to say that, we had an episode on the 91 reforms with Shruti Rajgopalan, you and I, on the Seen and the Unseen with Shruti. We spoke a lot about this. Shruti for the Mercatus Center does the 1991 project, fantastic project. She wrote this absolutely magisterial essay talking about this period, and I want to quote a couple of lines from there. Where about this Indira period, she wrote, "By the time Nehru's daughter Indira Gandhi took office, the official goal was to nationalize all means of production. Her government nationalized the 14 largest banks overnight through an ordinance and also nationalized coal and copper mines, general insurance, unprofitable textile firms, the list goes on, land ceiling laws, monopoly control, greater control over foreign exchange, inflexible labor regulations, disallowing the closure of unprofitable firms, and a hostile attitude to foreign investment. Some goods were hit with an import tariff of over 350%. The top income tax rate was 97.75%. All this cumulatively unleashed an informal and corruption-driven underground economy that some suspected was larger than the formal sector. By the late 1970s, it was almost impossible to set up a new business or to exit a falling business." And she also points out, for example, that there was a joke that when a girl child got married, people would tell her parents, "Book a scooter," so that by the time her wedding comes around, the scooter has been delivered. Those were the days. Like, India was the one country in the world where a second-hand car cost more than a new car, because a new car would take years to get delivered. The second-hand car was already there. And a lot of this was driven by politics. It wasn't even as if Indira Gandhi, had these convictions. It is just that she needed to sort of distinguish herself from the syndicate, as it were, with people like Morarji Desai. And this was tactically what she did to get the left on her side, this leftward tilt. And this is what I find, this is what breaks my heart. She didn't even believe in this shit. She was just a sociopath who didn't give a damn, who would do whatever it took to get to power. And people often talk about, the emergency, where of course half the opposition was in jail. You and I would have been in jail had we lived then. They talk about that as the worst of her excesses. And I really think her economic regulations were far worse. They kept millions of people in India in poverty for decades longer than necessary. And especially in the way that they stopped that labor-intensive manufacturing revolution that could have happened. Again, here's the Angus Madison chart. Look at where China takes off. India could have taken off before this, and we didn't. We had everything. We had the people who are our greatest strength, and we never did. And that kind of breaks my heart. But in all this, in the darkest moment, there is still hope. And I want you to talk about, we all keep saying 91 with good reason. The 91 reforms, incomplete as they were, much as they left a lot to be desired, got hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It has deep emotional value to me. It changed our lives. It certainly changed my life. But your point, which has been underscored by other guests I've had on this show, like the great Montek Singh Ahluwalia, is that it wasn't something that happened overnight in 91. That from the late 70s, it was there in the making, a silent revolution of people biding their time. Tell me about that.
Just on the history of ideas, yes, of course, Indira Gandhi is responsible for a lot of the terrible things there. But as with Nehru, she reflected that climate of opinion. I think of it as a failure of the Indian intellectual class. It was the intellectuals who were seduced by state power and central planning and the Soviet model and all that. It was the leftism of Indian intellectuals as a class which created the conditions in which these excesses could happen. And also around Indira Gandhi, I love the line that it was only Sanjay Gandhi's mother who could have declared the emergency, and it was only Jawaharlal Nehru's daughter who could have declared elections. So there was something in her mind which prevented her from going full third world tyrant. And we now know, because of the leaked information that has come out from that period that was flowing in the diplomatic bag, that it was clear to many, many people that Indira Gandhi was embarrassed about the emergency, and it was only a question of when and the elections would take place. And when elections took place in 1977, they were truly free and fair elections. There was no intimidation of opposition parties, there was no messing with election booths, and so on. So we lucked out in that episode. Okay, we went to the brink of catastrophe.
We also lucked
and we
out
came
because
back.
she actually thought she would win the elections when she called them, and Sanjay Gandhi did not want her to call the elections. He wanted
So
her to be
it's a
dictator for
little
life.
more than that. And I think the best reading of history today is that Jawaharlal Nehru's daughter was just embarrassed at becoming one more third world tyrant. Okay, she was too good for that. But then we get to 1977. So the Janata Party came to power, okay, and there were three great Gujaratis who became the most powerful people in the country. Morarji Desai was the Prime Minister, H.M. Patel was the Finance Minister, D.T. Lakdawala was the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, okay, and they understood a sense about the way the 60s and the 70s had gone bad. These were not radical reformers, but these were people who had instinct around the working of markets. So remember, D.T. Lakdawala had always been in Bombay University. He was never part of the leftist ethos of Delhi and the great economics organizations of Delhi. H.M. Patel had grown up in the proximity of Amul and the cooperative movement and so on. It was
Maybe India's next intellectual revolution can happen far from Delhi and lonely Karjat.
Yeah, so if the best ideas are always incubated far away. The further away you are from power, the more clearly you see. So these people started a gentle process of turning the ship. And there are very important staffing decisions which had to be done in order to bring in fresh ideas. And slowly the liberalization of the economy began. They would seem like small, trifling measures in some sense today, but in that age they were important. And I want to locate these around the words private sector confidence. Always and always and always, there is only one source of economic growth, and that is the private sector. And when the private sector feels good about the future, then the private sector responds by committing themselves to building firms. So the heart and soul of the story is always the hours per day that the leadership cadre of the private sector commits themselves to the project of building firms, to the extent to which their kids are committed to the same project, to the extent to which their money is being put back into the project. Okay, so the heart and soul of all Indian progress is a sense of optimism and trust in the eyes of the private sector. So the long night of the 62 to 77 period ended, and the private sector started cautiously trusting again and getting back into building businesses and taking interest in improving their organizations. And that kicked off growth surprisingly quickly. 1979 is a date that is stuck in my head, because when you do the careful econometrics, the date at which growth acceleration is announced in the econometric work is 1979. So some things were begun in 77 and they rapidly had an impact. And in 1979, it was visible as an acceleration of GDP growth. And then Indira Gandhi came back to power and she actually carried these ideas further. She didn't go back to her old style socialism. And then when Rajiv Gandhi became PM, again, he was a more modern person. He started pushing in many important directions. And so there was a sustained clarity around that period. Late in the 1980s, there was a big fiscal balance of payments disaster, which led up to the 91 program. Now, in the same period from 77 onwards, we also got a blossoming of Indian economic thinking. So I said that Nehru and Indira Gandhi and her period contained an intellectual landscape that was fundamentally leftist, that was basically inspired in a Marxian or a Soviet view of the world. That started changing in many important ways. Manmohan Singh's PhD thesis in 1964 was famously one of the first intellectual products which questioned export pessimism from India. At the time, people believed that because our skins are brown, we'll never be able to export. And Manmohan Singh was one of the early people to say, no, it's about incentives, it's about prices, it's about exchange rates. And it is possible for India to export and export well, and it is not something weird about India that this is infeasible. So a new set of ideas started bubbling in. For example, Monte Ahluwalia came to work for Rajiv Gandhi. Okay, these kinds of people carried new ideas. Of course, I've heard a lot about this period from Vijay Kelkar, who had come to work in the Planning Commission and at first had very leftist and communist views. But over the years, he also started questioning many of those things, and I've had the joy and the luxury of speaking with him in detail about his journey of ideas and about questioning the world. I think in that period, a lot of the Indian intellectual elite was just simply embarrassed by the success in East Asia. And again, you got to place this in perspective. In 1947, if there was a country where things were supposed to go well, it was India. Okay, this is the country of Gandhiji and Tagore and Ramanujan and Nehru and just, outrageously great people. So nowhere else amongst poor countries did you have that kind of intellectual capital. Did you have that kind of proud elite that could actually plug into this global state-of-the-art knowledge and do a rapid catch-up to British levels of per capita GDP. If there was a place to do it, it was India. And it was deeply embarrassing for the Indian elite that actually East Asia ran ahead of India. And I think they got slapped in the face, and the better amongst them started asking first principles questions that, this ain't working. I want to emphasize Arun Shuri in this process. Arun Shuri does not get enough recognition. He was a deeply grounded scholar in India, and many things that are attributed to Western scholars worldwide had actually been discovered and understood and articulated by Arun Shuri here in India first. And so these kinds of people really understood the venality and failure of the Indian socialist project of building agencies that will terrorize people and put people in jail and take bribes and all that. So there was a community, there was a literature of thinking people, of interesting people, who bit by bit started reducing the chokehold on the economy. And that took place from 77 onwards through the 80s. Their first cut was the domestic economy. So they did not touch the external side a whole lot, but many mistakes of public policy within the country were addressed through the 70s and 80s. And they did give gains through that period. And then the big thing that changed with 91 was reducing tariff barriers and improving the convertibility on the current account and a little bit of openness on the capital account. So all these things, they built on each other. Whenever we see grand social phenomena, it will never happen that there's a one-shot event or one single explanation. The world evolves through many, many actions, and then a new mood gets established in the eyes of the private sector. Always and always we should focus that what is the confidence of the private sector? Does the private sector feel optimistic about where India is going? Does the private sector feel safe about what is happening in the country? Then the private sector responds by bountifully investing, committing their emotions and people into building organizations in India. And then the growth follows.
There's a great quote by Abraham Lincoln about, if I have 6 hours to cut a tree, I'll spend the first 5 sharpening the axe.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that I can read into this a lesson that we must all sharpen our axes, even if we'll never cut a tree. Yeah. But we have to do it because when the opportunity comes, then we can do something with it. And I've had an episode with Vinay Sitapati or Narasimha Rao, another great figure of this period. And what strikes me when I read about these people, and Shruti's the 1991 project at the Mercatus Center, that has chronicles and oral histories of so many of these people, and they always fill me with awe, because it is not as if in 1991 one they got together and said, crisis hai, karte hai. No, for a decade and a half before that, they were working away, playing the long game, building ideas, and
and building each other.
building each other. And that's,
So I want to show two periods which are really inspiring for all of us. And the first of them is, roughly speaking, 1927 to 1947. Okay, in that period, you would be forgiven for thinking that the British Empire is infinitely powerful and there will never be a free India, so why bother? But the best and brightest of India actually dug in and bothered. And for better or for worse, they were each other's community. Okay, they wrote longhand letters to each other, and they argued and debated furiously about rival conceptions of what is India. The INC was a big tent. It accommodated all kinds of views, ranging from more anarchist to less anarchist, and they argued about what it meant to be free. So that when 1947 came along, there were people and there were documents and there was a body of knowledge which could go forward. And these people did not say that, oh, show me the pathway to gaining power to become some officer in some powerful government organization, and you show me that career track, then today I will invest in knowledge. Okay, and that's like a very narrow and selfish view of each person's place in society.
And if I may say so, just as we should remember those who fought that fight, we should also remember those who did not.
Yes. The vast majority, the mainstream, were just the appeasers. They collaborated with the British, and we should respect and admire the people who were willing to sign on to such journeys. Exactly the same story played out 1962 to 1977. I was born in 1966, and I have extensively had the opportunity to talk about this period with my elders. And this is the same story. Of course, there was despondence. There were many people who gave up and left the country. Okay, and every person had to make that call that, do you want to commit your life to this country? Do you want to commit your life to the project of studying this country? And there was no hope in sight. You never knew when the nightmare was going to end. And in fact, it looked like year after year, the nightmare just got worse. Okay, from the 62 war to another 65 war to 2 consecutive droughts to bank nationalization to double-digit inflation, the JP Andolan, the emergency. It just seemed to get worse and worse. For a good, decent, upstanding participant of the Indian freedom movement, it was just grotesque seeing the rise of the populist nationalist Indira Gandhi. It was just grotesque seeing the freedoms being stripped away. But the point is, the best of us chose to dig in, to stay, to build knowledge and to build community. And it was done in a non-purposive way. Manmohan Singh did not return to India after his PhD in 1964 with the promise that you will one day become a finance minister or you will one day become a prime minister. He had no idea. Nobody would have bet on 1,000,000 to 1 odds that this was going to happen.
And when he advised his young mentee, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, why don't you come back with me and work for the country? Yeah. And Montek leaves the World Bank and he comes back to do that. Yeah. He had no idea. And by the way,
the same with Manmohan Singh and Kelkar. They met in a corridor at a conference in Kathmandu. And basically in the conversation, Manmohan Singh said something to Kelkar like, so you will come and work for us, won't you? And Kelkar just felt obliged to say, yes, sir, I will. And Kelkar had packed his bags and was back in India. So these were the people who had no promise of power or success. And for all you knew, the Indian project was going to crash.
I have an anecdote here for our viewers about Vijay Kelkar, your co-author. Great book, In Service of the Republic. In fact, the book is In Service of the Republic. And when you guys recorded with me, if you remember that we were recording in a studio in Khar and there was a break and Mr. Kelkar went to the toilet, and when he came back, he pointed his finger at me and he said, Amit, I want to give you one piece of advice. So I thought, okay, some great piece of wisdom is going to come at me. And I said, yes, sir, tell me. So he said, every time you pass a toilet, enter it. So that is, the wise passing on their wisdom to younger folks.
So in similar fashion, I feel that people should not ask for fate to step out of the page of history and shake your hand. People should just be quiet and dig in and work hard, and you have no right to ask for any reward. But it is our job to build knowledge and build community, and we have no telling which way the world will go.
And the 91 reforms are both remarkable in what we managed to get done, also deeply sad in what we didn't manage to get to. We didn't get done. We didn't reform factor markets. Agriculture was left, etc., etc. We've spoken about that at length actually in our episode of The Seen and the Unseen. So I'll just point people to that. We've almost been talking for an hour now. And I want to ask you about the next aspect, the next phase of our history. We have always been lamenting that, okay, from 91 to 2011, we had a golden period where everything kind of went right. And we have since then what Pooja Mehra calls a lost decade. I've had an episode with Pooja on this. You've spoken about this to me a lot. And once again, it's not as if, 2011 is where you see the economy go kind of down, but it's really 2008 that process sort of started. And just to kind of summarize, after independence, we had sort of the Hindu rate of growth at 5% for the longest time, but better than what came before. And then 79 onwards, as you point out, in econometric terms, you see a jump, and it goes from 5 to 5.5, and then 91 7.5 upwards and onwards, and since 2011 we've kind of been not doing so well. So tell me a little bit about two aspects of this. Why did we stop doing well? Did we take reforms for granted, and did we not realize that this has to be a continuous process and not just ad hoc policies here and there? And also, is there such an intellectual community still today which is still fighting the good fight?
It's important to psychoanalyze what happened in the 91 to 2011 period. The Indian state was far from fixed. There were many, many things wrong with the working of the state. What I think the early years did was to tell the private sector a story that, yeah, things are really bad, but you know what? They're going to get better. That there are people running the place that know what to do, and we've got our shit together in terms of the work process, and year after year we'll make progress, and there is a direction in reforms. So the private sector was willing to suspend its disbelief and take the leap, saying, yeah, I know many things are deeply broken, but we're getting better, and we trust that there is a crew which will make things better. Okay, that was one part to it. The other part is something about the growth project and the social contract between the elite that is required to make any country work. In every country, there are four kinds of elite. There is the state, the political and the bureaucratic elite. There is a business elite. There is the intellectual elite. And then there is a cultural elite. These four elites interact with each other. And these four elites need to have a bargain, a compact, a social contract. The social contract in India in that period could be described as saying that the private sector was encouraged and comfortable and confident to go forth and invest, to go forth and build and take risks. And every now and then something would go wrong vis-a-vis the Indian state. Because remember, the Indian state was not fixed. Large chunks of nonsense littered the landscape in terms of the working of the Indian state, and every private person was going to hit landmines sometime or the other. What the elite compact gave was the optimism that, yeah, every now and then things will go wrong, but I will have the ability to file a bug report, and I will have the ability to find some recourse. So when things went wrong, you got an audience. There were people who would listen to what went wrong, and oftentimes they would solve it. There was an element of corruption in the way these things worked. But the bottom line is the private sector was not shown an impassive, cruel, and expropriatory state. It was shown medium optimism that, yeah, every now and then you will hit a landmine, but many of the times those landmines will get fixed. And remember, in the backdrop, some reforms process is going on, and there are really cool people who are the leadership of the economists and the officials and the politicians who get this shit. So when I was in the Ministry of Finance, we understood this very well. In the DEA, the Department of Economic Affairs of that age, every joint secretary would go out and do 2 conference speeches every week. Because part of the story was showing a capability, was showing a thought process. The private sector needed to see the kind of people they would respect. And they needed to see a vision, they needed to see a strategy. And when the private sector would see all that, they would feel confident and they would invest. And what went wrong over the 91 to 2011 period was that increasingly the deeds were inadequate compared to the words. And it became increasingly clear that there was a venal, expropriative, interfering state which was actually creeping and enhancing its powers. Okay, so one by one, horrible laws kept coming in. New kinds of powers were taken up by state agencies. Central planning got worse, not better. And like I say to you, my summary statistic is that there was less freedom in 2010 than there was in 2000, and there was less freedom in 2020 than there was in 2010. And that whole magic of private sector optimism was disrupted, and hence growth decayed. Now, in terms of a community of knowledge, are we building a new world of that knowledge? I'm cautiously optimistic that in some fundamental ways, the community that worked on 1991 to 2011 had weak knowledge of the first principles. So if you think about state capacity, public administration, law, freedom, market failure, regulation, some of the basic knowledge of that world was weak. So Kelkar and I wrote that book, first edition 2019, second edition 2022, reflecting the fact that a lot of those things that I think we today in the intellectual community take as solved were not known in 2010. So in that sense, there was a significant knowledge barrier there. A lot of good knowledge has been built. But on the other hand, the working of government is just at a different plane altogether. And we never know when some of the lines will be connected up once again.
I want to think about the accidents of his history, the happy accidents, the sad accidents. To me, one happy accident certainly is that you had that continuity in politics right from the time where you had Narasimha Rao, who was a prime minister who put all his political capital into making this happen, and the incredible cadre of people who worked with him in 91. But you had political continuity. You know, the Vajpayee government did a lot of good work. After that, Manmohan Singh did a lot of good work. I mean, just to kind of summarize for my listeners, and I have had episodes on this, I'll link from the show notes, but essentially the big problem with 2008, what happened was that 2008, 2009, around that time, everything was going well. Manmohan Singh was Prime Minister, Chidambaram was Finance Minister, and at this point, what was essentially happening was the financial crisis had just happened of 2008, and they were dealing with it really well, and everything was going fine, and you actually worked there at the time, so maybe you can elaborate on that. But then the terrorist attacks on Mumbai happened. The Home Minister Shivraj Patil was incompetent, unable to handle it. Manmohan Singh wanted his best man on the job, that was Chidambaram. That meant the finance ministry was now empty. And Manmohan Singh would have stepped into that for the longest time until Chidambaram came back, except that he had to go in for an operation that January, if I remember. And Sonia Gandhi got Pranab Mukherjee into that post. And Pranab Mukherjee was a disaster. He was a socialist thinker from the Indira 70s, and everything he thought and knew about economics was completely wrong. And he had a free hand because he had Sonia's backing, and the economy gradually went to hell. A lot of the shit that happened then, like retrospective taxation and so on, were all Pranab's doing, to the point that circa 2013, people realized that this man is really going to take us down, and they, got him kicked him upstairs to the presidency. Chidambaram comes back. Chidambaram tries his best for a while. Then 2014, the government changes, and the Jaitley ministry actually shows continuity. And again, you have that same golden continuity where they carry on those policies for a while, but then politics takes over in 2015 onwards, everything goes to hell. Let's not elaborate on that. But this is kind of the summary that I have. And you are actually...
But I want to dig deeper into it. So yes, of course, it's dumb luck. There was a terrorist attack which had enormous consequences for India in precisely the ways that you describe. I find that a deeply dissatisfying solution because there will always be good and bad luck. So I have mulled over this period and I will tell a different story. The story I will tell is that there was low intellectual capacity in the work of the reforms after 1991, so that the fundamental machinery of government was intact. Freedom had not gone up. The laws were still oppressive. In fact, the laws of 2008-9, at the period that we are describing, were more oppressive than the laws of 1991. what was keeping the ship aloft was certain individuals, which to me is an unacceptable and fragile way of building a country. So, what we need to do is to get better laws to enshrine greater levels of freedom into the statutes and build organization designs into government departments and government organizations so that the working of the government is not so vulnerable. As a counterexample, I hold to you the remarkable period of the United States where Donald Trump became president. And you know what? A lot of the parts of the United States government worked as usual. That is institutional quality. That you get an unimaginably bad character as a head of state, but the state has an institutional quality of its own. And that to me is the essence of what the 91 period failed to do. It was a lack of knowledge around the words freedom, public administration, laws, organization, design, checks and balances, all the stuff that, Kelkar and I built into the book and that would today be widely known in India amongst a new generation of intellectuals was not known in that period. And so that was more like a sensible, good bunch of people taking the reins of power, operating an old repressive apparatus in better ways. That was not rebuilding the apparatus.
Before we get to our recommendations, I want to cycle back to that value that we spoke of at the start of the episode, freedom.
Yes.
Where are we with freedom today? Because we often think that the long arc of history will inevitably take us towards justice, freedom, all of those beautiful things. Yeah. But I get more and more despondent about that in the current times that we live in.
We should not be despondent in the current times. We should be cautious through our reading of history. Okay, so that's it. It's cold and clear that a great dawn of Deng Xiaoping in 1978 has turned into a horrible period in China today. A great dawn of Russia at the collapse of the USSR has turned into a disgusting period today. The great flourishing of freedom in the Weimar Republic turned into Nazi Germany. So
everything beautiful becomes something horrible. Is that your lesson? Give me the opposite lesson.
Well, out of the ashes of post-war Germany and Japan, you could have been despondent that these are disgusting militaristic states. You could have said that the German mind is fundamentally obedient. Okay, so that Germany can never achieve democracy
and
because they will just obey any strong man. You could have said all those things about Germany. You could have said that the Japanese people are imperialistic, militaristic. But look at what beautiful countries have come out of these two.
Indeed.
So we should not take things for granted and we should never lull ourselves to the dangers and the pitfalls. That said, it is our job to, be thinkers, to keep talking, to keep thinking, to keep understanding. And the world is a rich and wonderful place and progress can always happen. Very well, Amit, we are at the end of this. Tell us, what are your fun recommendations for this week?
So I want to recommend two books, and they're both books by the same author. One of them is co-authored, and they're books by Tripurdaman Singh, who's been on my show twice to talk about them. One of them is a superb book called 16 Stormy Days, which is about India's First Amendment. And reading that book, you realize how much damage our First Amendment did to us. That just as the US's First Amendment sort of enshrined free speech for them, ours kind of went the other way. It was a blow against free speech. And to listen to the arguments at the time, in the Lok Sabha and elsewhere, where Nehru is taking fundamentally illiberal positions because the reason he clamped down on free speech was because he wanted to clamp down on his communist rivals, and he wanted, that full centralizing impulse had taken over and had taken him over at a personal level, which is a great tragedy. Such a great statesman, but also such a flawed human being that his hubris takes him to a point where he will not tolerate dissent. So a fantastic book. And the other great book is also by Tripurdaman Singh and Adil Hussain, a very fine Pakistani origin scholar studied in Germany. Fantastic mind. I had an episode with both of them as well, one of my sleeper hits of last year. And that book is called Nehru, The Debates That Define India. And it's Nehru's debates with a bunch of people, with Jinnah, with Shyama Prasad Mukherjee. And what you realize in these debates that Nehru has with these guys, which is their letters to each other and Patel, is that they are all fine minds, every single one of them. So you can look at the Nehru Shama Prasad Mukherjee and you can disagree with Nehru as I do, because he was taking the illiberal stance that, hey, free speech can have many caveats, and Shama Prasad Mukherjee was, no, free speech must be absolute. And you can, it doesn't matter whether you agree or disagree. What is beautiful to see is that here are these great people in public office talking to each other in good faith, not saying you are this and you are that and etc. etc., but recognizing that everyone has good intentions. Assume goodwill, which is one of my cardinal rules in conversation. Assume goodwill unless you have reason to believe otherwise. And that spirit, we have totally lost it in public office, and we've totally lost it in the public discourse, and I find it so inspiring.
And I'm very pleased about what you and I are doing in this show, which is we disagree many times, but viewers are sometimes scratching their head saying, do you guys agree on this or do you guys disagree on this?
And on that note, you don't have any recommendations for today, so you have to give double recommendations next week, Ajay. Please kindly prepare. And on that note, goodbye from us. Please like and subscribe. We really need you to like and subscribe. Come on, we're trying so hard. It's a labor of love. So support us, share the show widely. I hope you enjoyed yourself. Thank you.